Hello everyone, and especially to my young viewers and nighttime listeners. Welcome back. I'm the Crime Whisper. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, and I'm here to guide you through another chilling case. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let your breathing slow down, and let's begin. Case 1. The Frozen Trail. Human trafficking in Finland, 2012. In the stillness of winter, 2012, as snow quietly blanketed the streets of Kouvola, Finland, something dark was unfolding beneath the surface. A human trafficking network unlike anything the country had seen before. This wasn't the kind of crime you'd notice in passing. It didn't scream for attention. It moved silently, hidden in plain sight, orchestrated by people who thrived in the shadows. They wove together lies, threats, and manipulation into an invisible prison. And slowly, their secret began to unravel. At the heart of it all was a man named Oscar Järvinen, a middle-aged Finnish national who, to the outside world, seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved, polite. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Neighbors described him as respectful and unremarkable. No one suspected that behind that door he was operating one of the largest trafficking rings in Finland's history. Oscar had grown up just an hour away in the small town of Kiti. His childhood was uneventful. His parents, a mechanic and a school teacher, raised him with traditional values. But something shifted in Oscar as he grew older. He became distant, withdrawn, and by his 20s, he left his hometown for Kouvola in search of something more. What he found wasn't a new life, it was a new obsession. Oscar took a job as a logistics coordinator at a transport company. Mundane work that offered him one key advantage: access. And with that access, Oscar began to quietly build a network. It started online: cryptic forums, encrypted chats, and back-channel conversations about moving people across borders. He watched, he learned, he listened, and most of all, he studied desperation. Oscar discovered how many people, especially in Eastern Europe, were desperate to escape poverty, war, or persecution. They would do anything for a chance at a better life. And that's exactly what he promised them. But it was all a lie. Behind him stood a network: recruiters, fixers, and facilitators. Some were in it for money, others for power. But all of them helped Oscar lure vulnerable men, women, and children into a nightmare. He offered them work in restaurants, factories, and construction. But once they arrived in Finland, their passports were taken. They were crammed into filthy, overcrowded apartments. They worked long hours for almost no pay, and they were watched constantly. The operation spread quickly. Word traveled through villages, refugee camps, and cities. Oscar's name was never mentioned, but his promise of opportunity was. More and more people came, and more were trapped. Some worked in illegal sweatshops, others in underground brothels, some behind the counter of everyday businesses. For a long time, no one noticed. Oscar was careful. His network was loyal, and he used legitimate businesses as a cover, laundering profits and masking his tracks. But then, someone escaped. A young woman, terrified and bruised, managed to slip away. Her captor had let his guard down for just a moment, and she ran. She made it to a police station, trembling, malnourished, and finally, she spoke. That was the crack in the wall. A secret investigation began. Slowly, survivors came forward, telling stories of forced labor, abuse, and fear. The police identified Oscar as the mastermind, and one cold evening, as he returned home to his apartment, they were waiting. He was arrested without incident. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because Oscar wasn't acting alone. The deeper authorities dug, the more disturbing the truth became. They uncovered another name, Mikko Risio. a man with a criminal past and a reputation for slipping through the cracks. Miko was a ghost, moving from town to town, job to job, mistake to mistake, until he found his place in Oscar's empire. While Oscar built the web, Miko pulled the strings across Europe. He knew the dark alleys, the corrupt officials, the underground trade routes, and he expanded the network far beyond Finland, reaching into Russia, Eastern Europe, and even parts of Asia. His team was small but loyal people who didn't flinch at suffering because they profited from it. Together, Oscar and Miko had created a trafficking pipeline hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, and it had gone unnoticed for far too long. But no secret stays buried forever. And one by one the voices of the silenced began to rise. The web expands, the hidden syndicate for years. Some of those involved in the trafficking network had been seasoned criminals, others were fresh recruits, eager to climb the ranks of the underworld. Whatever their reasons, they were all cogs in a vast, cruel machine. Their job was simple: move the victims silently and efficiently from one quiet town in Finland to another, until they vanished into a life of servitude and abuse. But with growth came exposure. Miko Rizio, the elusive co-mastermind, failed to recognize that his expanding empire had drawn more than just envy from rival traffickers. The authorities, though initially hesitant, had begun to piece together a troubling pattern. A growing list of missing persons reports, all strangely connected, all pointing towards something far bigger than local crime. And then came the breakthrough. Undercover officers were deployed to infiltrate the network. Bit by bit, the puzzle began to form. What was once believed to be a localized trafficking ring based in Kouvola was actually a node in a sprawling international syndicate, reaching across borders and oceans. The first major strike came during a covert surveillance operation. Authorities intercepted a shipment, not of goods, but of people. A group of trafficked individuals, disguised with fake travel documents, were being moved across the Finnish border. But this time, law enforcement was ready. A high-speed chase followed, tense, chaotic, and when it ended, several of Miko's associates were in custody. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered a treasure trove of evidence: encrypted communications, burner phones, falsified passports, and chilling video surveillance. The truth that emerged was horrifying. Men, women, children, all promised a new life, all betrayed. They were sold into labor camps, forced into sexual exploitation, and held in appalling conditions. Their dreams shattered, their voices silenced. As the investigation expanded, it became evident that Ricio's influence reached further than anyone imagined. His network wasn't made up of petty criminals. It included powerful players from across Eastern Europe, some rumored to be part of a secretive, highly coordinated trafficking enterprise. These traffickers were experts, masters in smuggling humans across borders, often through countries where oversight was weak or corrupt. The most vulnerable were targeted: those living in poverty, those fleeing war zones, those desperate for hope. They were promised jobs, safety, freedom, and instead found themselves in captivity. Meanwhile, the Finnish police uncovered more disturbing details. The city of Kouvola had served as the primary hub, but it wasn't alone. Helsinki to Tampere. Each city had its own network, its own stash houses, its own set of recruiters and enforcers. And the deeper the authorities dug, the clearer it became. Finland was just one stop along a transnational pipeline of exploitation. By the time law enforcement was ready to act, Miko Rizio had disappeared. He slipped into the shadows, using safe houses, false identities, and trusted contacts to stay ahead of the authorities. But even in his absence, the machine kept running. His lieutenants continued the trade, tightening security, covering their tracks. But now the police had something they didn't have before: survivors. And the survivors were ready to speak. The stories they shared were harrowing: torture, starvation, threats, manipulation. But there was also resilience. Some victims had managed to escape, a few by brute courage, others by gaining the trust of someone within the ring who still had a conscience. These brave souls became key witnesses. Their testimony gave investigators a clear view into the inner workings of Ricio's network. One of the most vital voices was Maria, a young woman from Moldova. She had been trafficked under the promise of a factory job in Finland. But the moment she arrived in Kouvola, she was isolated, beaten, and forced into grueling labor with barely enough food or rest to survive. Day after day, she endured. But eventually, a factory worker, someone who had seen the abuse but had been too afraid to act, chose to help her. With their aid, Maria escaped, and she made it to the Finnish police. Her testimony was the thread investigators needed to begin pulling apart the entire operation. What they found was staggering. The traffickers had designed a complex network, smuggling routes across borders, safe houses in multiple countries, forged identity documents, front companies posing as restaurants, warehouses, and factories. They worked with disturbing precision. Victims were hidden in shipping containers, beneath floorboards of cars, or crammed into trucks posing as commercial transport. They were moved quickly, quietly, and with ruthless efficiency. By now, Finnish authorities were no longer working alone. Europe had been brought in. Neighboring nations began to cooperate. The web of organized crime was being mapped out, city by city, country by country. And time was running out. Every day that passed was another day someone suffered. The traffickers were brutal, and when people outlived their usefulness, they were discarded without mercy. In the midst of this race against time, Mikko Ricio remained missing. Despite the mountain of evidence, he had vanished without a trace. Some believed he had fled the continent. Others feared he was still hiding in plain sight. But the Finnish police pressed on. Even without Ricio, the evidence was overwhelming. They had names, locations, communication trails, and they had a plan. The traffickers had hidden behind a veneer of legitimacy, posing as business owners, labor recruiters, and logistics managers. But behind those doors were cages. And so, the police prepared for coordinated raids across the country. They were going to strike fast, hard, and everywhere at once, because finally, after years in the dark, the victims were being seen. Continuation. The reckoning. The coordinated raids unfolded with precision. Law enforcement units struck simultaneously across several safe houses, places where victims had been held in silence. Some for months, others for years. What they found was harrowing, as doors were broken down and officers swept through cramped, dimly lit rooms. Survivors emerged, many stunned, some in tears, others frozen in disbelief. Some collapsed into the arms of officers. Others could barely process that the nightmare was finally over. It was a moment of overwhelming emotion, freedom wrapped in trauma. For many, it was the first time they had seen sunlight, spoken to a stranger freely, or even dared to hope. But the fight was far from over. The traffickers captured in the raids were interrogated, but they gave up little. Many had been trained to withstand questioning, conditioned to remain silent. They knew what was at stake, not just for themselves, but for the vast hidden machinery behind them. It became clear that dismantling the entire syndicate would take more than a few arrests. This was only the beginning. Meanwhile, the hunt for Mikko Ricio intensified. New intelligence revealed that Mikko had likely fled Finland just days before the raids. The trail led to Russia, where it was believed he had taken refuge with contacts deep inside organized crime circles. It was a crushing blow. If Mikko was truly embedded with syndicates in Russia, bringing him to justice would be far more complicated. But investigators were undeterred. They expanded their reach, initiating cooperation with international law enforcement, including Russian authorities. They knew the operation was global, and so their pursuit would have to be just as relentless. Back in Finland, survivors began to speak. Their stories were raw, painful, and deeply moving. One woman, Alina, shared her experience of being sold into slavery as a teenager. Promised a job and a new life in Finland, she instead found herself imprisoned in a factory working long, punishing hours for no pay. She had been beaten when she tried to escape. She lived in constant fear. Her voice trembled as she told her story, but her resolve did not. She wanted justice, and she wasn't alone. One by one, survivors came forward. Men and women from different backgrounds, different countries each, with their own scars. Some bore the marks of physical abuse. Others had been psychologically broken down through manipulation and fear. But they had something in common: the courage to speak, and the hope that their testimony would help bring the entire network down, and that hope fueled the investigation. The police dug deeper, combing through financial records, phone data, and international travel logs. The traffickers were clever, but the walls were closing in. Then a break. A former insider, disillusioned by what they had witnessed, came forward. They had worked for the traffickers reluctantly at first, then out of fear, but now they were ready to speak. Their information was game-changing. They provided names, locations, operational structures, and most importantly, they exposed international branches of the network. New raids were planned this time across borders, and while investigators in Finland worked through their leads, a second story was beginning to unfold. Shift the shadow front, it began quietly. Late summer, 2017. Detective Erica Ladine, of the Kouvola Police Department, started noticing a strange pattern in reports coming across her desk. They weren't dramatic. They didn't scream for attention, just small details, subtle inconsistencies, quiet whispers. But Erica had been in law enforcement for over 15 years, and she knew when something wasn't right. The reports involved missing persons, mostly young men and women from Eastern Europe. At first glance, they looked like cases of runaway teens or individuals lost in the world of undocumented migration, but the similarities couldn't be ignored. Then came the connection. Several of the missing individuals had reportedly been in contact with a company known as Valava Solutions. At face value, Valava seemed ordinary, boring, even a low-profile logistics firm operating out of downtown Kouvola. But when Erica looked deeper, she saw movement. People crossing borders in tightly patterned waves, often directed by the same small group of names. One of them was Victor Koronin. Koronin didn't stand out. He was polished, soft-spoken, wore tailored suits, and carried a warm smile. He ran a modest shipping office in the heart of town, and on the surface, everything about him screamed normal. But the deeper Erica dug, the darker it became. Koronin wasn't just a businessman. He was a gatekeeper in a vast trafficking syndicate that stretched far beyond Finland. His company served as the perfect front: legitimate shipments, hiding human cargo, false invoices, masking smuggling routes. Koronin had been in the game for years. He knew how to erase trails, how to pivot when watched, how to keep loyalty through fear. Encrypted communications, paid-off employees, constant surveillance of his own team, and worse, he wasn't acting alone. As Erica and her team expanded their investigation, they realized that Valava Solutions wasn't a one-off front. It was part of a network of cover companies, each playing a role in the syndicate's machinery. Victims were funneled through Finland from across Europe, then sold into various black market industries, forced labor, sex trafficking, and even illegal adoption. The scale of the operation was staggering. What had begun as a local investigation was now one of the largest human trafficking cases in Finnish history, and it was still growing. The deeper Erica looked, the more powerful the enemy became. Koronin had connections, dangerous ones, people in high places, people willing to protect him. But Erica and her team weren't backing down. They had uncovered the truth. Now, they were ready to bring it into the light. Case TWOA's The investigation into Korahonen's operations deepened. The sheer scale of his criminal empire began to unfold. Hidden facilities were discovered, small, secretive locations scattered throughout Finland and bordering countries. These remote sites were intentionally chosen, isolated enough that no one could hear the victims' screams. But what started as a trafficking probe quickly revealed something far more sinister. Many of those trafficked weren't just victims, they were pawns in a calculated high-stakes game. The case had evolved into a deadly cat-and-mouse chase with a criminal enterprise so sophisticated, it seemed nearly untouchable. The deeper Lynn and her team pushed, the more danger closed in around them. Korhonen had taken notice. As pressure mounted, he activated his fail-safes, pulling strings and wiping digital footprints. His network operated with surgical precision, covert, fluid, and nearly invisible. Those involved moved like ghosts, leaving no trace behind. One major breakthrough came when the team tracked down one of Hanan's longtime couriers, an older man living under an alias in a modest Helsinki apartment. For years, he had kept his head down, moving packages and people without asking questions. But with law enforcement closing in, the cracks started to show. After multiple interviews, he finally began to talk. Although he didn't know the full scope, what he did reveal was chilling. He described Honan's most insidious tactic. The mules people used to move sedated victims across borders, hidden inside false vehicle compartments and sealed cargo crates. These victims weren't just trafficked for forced labor or sex. Some were sold into underground adoption rings. Others were subjected to illegal medical testing, their identities erased, their bodies commodified. This was no ordinary trafficking operation. It was a global marketplace of human lives, refined and protected over years of careful planning, and at its center stood Korhanen, a man who had built his empire so meticulously, even elite agencies had failed to infiltrate it. The next lead came in the form of a tip, an upcoming shipment crossing the Finnish border into Russia. On paper, the cargo was labeled as furniture, but Lynn's instincts screamed otherwise. She ordered a full surveillance op, deploying units to monitor the shipment's path in real time. Suspicious behavior emerged, quickly in planned stops, abrupt route changes, and erratic conduct at border checkpoints. Lynn knew this was their moment. If they could intercept the transport, they might finally bring Honan down. But failure would mean more lives lost, more victims swallowed by the system. Everything hinged on this one operation. Police units were positioned across the route. Lynn's team was on high alert, watching every move as the shipment approached its final destination. Then, without warning, the trucks veered off the main road, heading deep into the dense forests of southeastern Finland. It was a clear sign. Honan knew. He had caught wind of the sting and was already one step ahead, willing to vanish his convoy into the wilderness to protect his empire. Lynn's team reacted instantly, abandoning vehicles to pursue on foot. The terrain was rough mud, and thick underbrush slowed every step. But they had no choice. They were racing against time to save whoever was inside those trucks. As they pushed deeper, the forest grew darker, heavier. Every sound was amplified. The crack of a branch, the thrum of adrenaline. Then, movement. Dark figures darted between the trees. The convoy had stopped. This was it. Lynn signaled for her team to move. Weapons drawn, they surged forward. But just as they closed in gunshots, loud, sharp, and relentless, chaos erupted. Lynn dove behind a tree as bullets ripped through the forest air. The traffickers were armed, well-trained, and expecting an ambush. It wasn't just a rescue op. Now it was a battle for survival. She ordered her team to spread out, attempting to flank the convoy and seal off any escape. But the forest betrayed them. Thick, disorienting, unforgiving. The enemy moved with precision. These weren't low-level smugglers. They were organized, trained, loyal to Honan in ways that defied Reason: this wasn't just a trafficking network, it was a militarized criminal operation, with personnel ready to kill, to keep it alive. And for Lynn and her team, it was a grim reminder. They weren't just hunting a criminal, they were taking on an empire. Authorities in Utah were unprepared for what they were about to uncover. One of the largest human trafficking operations the state had ever seen. It all began as a routine investigation into smuggling routes along the southwestern border. But what started as a simple probe quickly escalated into a high-profile case that would peel back the curtain on a horrifying network of exploitation hidden in plain sight. At the center of it all was a man known in underground circles as Victor Torres to the outside world. Torres was an unremarkable figure, a quiet man in his mid-40s. He worked as a mechanic in the small town of St. George, Utah. He'd been part of the community for over a decade, known only as the guy who fixed cars and kept to himself. But that was only the surface. Behind the ordinary facade, Torres was a central figure in an international human trafficking syndicate that spanned multiple states, with Utah as one of its primary strongholds. For years, he operated in the shadows, building an intricate network of deceit, transport routes, and recruiters while staying one step ahead of law enforcement. His journey into the criminal world began in the early 2010s. At first, Torres played a minor role in trafficking operations focused on forced labor. His skills as a mechanic provided the perfect cover, allowing him to work unnoticed. But over time, he rose through the ranks, becoming a key player in a system built on exploitation and cruelty. By the time investigators began closing in, Torres had constructed a sophisticated infrastructure, safe houses, front businesses, smuggling routes that crossed state lines, and a loyal team of operatives who did his bidding. Narrator's shift to investigative tone. The first red flags appeared in 2020. Local authorities noticed a disturbing pattern. Undocumented migrant workers were vanishing without explanation. A few were later discovered, wandering the desert disoriented, dehydrated, and traumatized. Their stories were hauntingly similar. They had been promised decent jobs, construction, agriculture, or domestic work, but instead, they found themselves trapped in deplorable conditions, working grueling hours for little or no pay. Escape attempts were met with threats or outright violence. The deeper law enforcement dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Torres was using a web of shady recruiters, primarily operating in Central and South America to lure desperate individuals with false promises. Once in the U.S., their passports and documents were confiscated. They became invisible, powerless. And it wasn't just forced labor. As investigators would learn, Torres had also expanded into sex trafficking. Women, especially young and vulnerable, were coerced, sold, and circulated through an underground network of brothels, clubs, and private residences. Held in isolation, they endured starvation, beatings, and psychological abuse. Many were never seen in public again. Narrator's somber tone resumes. The operation was ruthless, and Torres, he remained a ghost present everywhere, yet nowhere at once. Months passed. More victims came forward. Each testimony added another layer to the horror. The turning point came when a woman, after surviving 6 months of captivity as a domestic servant in Salt Lake City, escaped and contacted police. Her account was graphic, heartbreaking, but crucial. She gave names, locations, patterns, and most importantly, she gave them Torres. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. The task force, now involving state and federal agencies, traced Torres' network across Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado. Safe houses, shell companies, fronts for transport, and recruitment. Every lead brought them closer to their target. Narrator, intensifying suspense. The final break came when authorities tracked a key associate, Juan Rivera, to a remote region in southern Utah. Rivera was in charge of transporting victims across state lines, and through his phone records, investigators located one of the last suspected safe houses. It was a weathered ranch house, isolated deep in the desert, surrounded by miles of barren land. The house was quite eerily so. Surveillance confirmed it. This was where Victor Torres was hiding. The operation to bring him down was set in motion. Narrator dramatic shift, cinematic tone, under the cover of darkness. The task force moved in. They had rehearsed this moment. For weeks. There was no room for error. Torres was known for his caution, always anticipating, always ready to disappear. He had lookouts, traps, and enough loyal men to turn a raid into a bloodbath. The desert swallowed their footsteps. Gravel crunched softly under boots. The night was still, heavy. Every second carried the weight of what was to come. The teams one approached the front. The other circled the back. No movement, no lights. The house stood like a ghost in the desert. Then, at a silent signal, they breached. Doors crashed open. Shouts echoed. Flashlights cut through darkness. Inside, they found what they had feared and more. Victims, young women, workers chained and bruised, rooms converted into cages. And at the heart of it all, Victor Torres finally cornered after nearly a decade. In the shadows, narrator reflective closed the takedown of Victor. Torres marked the end of a long and painful chapter for many, but it also shed light on the terrifying depth of human trafficking. In the US, it was a wake-up call. Not just about one man bet, about the system he exploited. Behind every statistic is a face, a life, a name, and thanks to the courage of survivors and the persistence of investigators, this particular network of cruelty was brought to an end. But the fight against human trafficking, that's far from over. The capture of Victor Torres, Detective Claire Ellis, gave the silent signal. Within seconds, the door was breached and officers stormed the house, guns drawn, senses sharpened for any sign of Victor Torres. The interior was unnervingly quiet. Dim light flickered from aging lamps, casting long shadows that danced on peeling walls. Claire had led enough raids to know that silence often meant danger. The team swept through the rooms, methodically. No resistance, no sound. But what they did find chilled them to the bone. Empty cages, heavy chains bolted to the walls, and makeshift dormitories that reeked of captivity. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison masquerading as a home. The place was filthy and oppressive. Scattered belongings, decayed food, and stained mattresses painted a grim picture of the suffering that had occurred within these walls. The officers could feel it in the air. This house had borne witness to unspeakable horrors. But Torres was gone. Despite the evidence of prolonged captivity, the building was now deserted. The officers fanned out, searching the property and beyond. Then Claire spotted a flicker of movement near the far edge of the land. A shadow, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. She motioned to the others, and the chase began. The terrain was rugged. Rocky outcrops and sparse brush slowed their pace, but the team pushed forward. Torres was fast, almost preternaturally so. He knew the land. He had run these paths before. Radio chatter erupted. Units were closing in, but Torres had the upper hand. He was elusive, hardened by years of evasion and deeply familiar with the area. Claire pressed on, each breath labored in the sweltering desert heat. Then, finally, they saw him, crouched behind a jagged rock formation, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the setting sun. The pursuit had driven them deep into a labyrinth of canyons where the terrain curled in on itself, turning the landscape into a natural trap. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she signaled her team to close in. This was it, the end game. She called out for Torres to surrender. For a moment, he hesitated. His eyes darted, scanning for escape. But he saw it too. There was nowhere left to run. Still, he didn't give up. With one final burst of desperation, Torres bolted toward a narrow canyon. The team pursued him, without hesitation, their footsteps echoing off canyon walls that loomed like prison bars. Cornered and out of options, Torres finally stopped. He turned to face them not with fear, but with a hollow defiance, as if he knew the empire he had built on pain and suffering was finally over. His arrest marked the collapse of one of the most expansive human trafficking networks in U.S. history. The victory was profound, but deeply bittersweet. The trauma left behind couldn't be erased. Families shattered, lives forever altered. And though Torres would never hurt another soul, the cost of justice had already been devastatingly high. Claire knew their work was far from over. In the aftermath of the arrest, Torres was taken to a secure facility for interrogation. He wasn't going to break easy. For years, he'd operated with surgical precision, maintaining tight control over his network. His influence ran deep, embedded in legitimate businesses and dark corners of society, but arrogance had been his undoing. The investigation that brought him down was a coordinated effort, federal, state, and local agencies working together with a singular mission: dismantle every piece of Torres's operation. And as the weeks passed, the full scope began to emerge. This wasn't just Utah. Web extended nationwide and beyond. Human trafficking was only one facet. His empire spanned drug smuggling, illegal arms sales, and money laundering, all concealed under layers of legitimate-looking fronts. Claire spent day and night unraveling it. Every lead she followed revealed another branch, another name, another hideout. The complexity was staggering, but they couldn't afford to rush. Exposure could tip off powerful allies, who would disappear before they could be caught. Meanwhile, the survivors were being moved to safe houses. Many had been imprisoned so long they barely remembered life outside captivity. They were offered medical care, counseling, and most importantly, freedom. Some didn't even know what to do with it, and Claire couldn't stop thinking about the damage already done, the lives that would never return to what they once were. The trauma these victims carried would outlive Torres's sentence by decades. As law enforcement continued raiding additional properties, warehouses, rural homes, hidden compounds, the scale of what Torres had built came into horrifying focus. Every new location unearthed more pain. Claire stood at the center of it all. The house, the desert, the manhunt, the network, the victims. This wasn't just a bust. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And Detective Claire Ellis was just getting started. They worked around the clock, dismantling the operation piece by piece, raiding safe houses, gathering evidence, building the case. But the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the discoveries became. It was a world soaked in cruelty, a network where suffering was currency, and human lives were just assets to be traded. Victor Torres had begun cooperating cautiously, and only on his terms. He made it clear he wouldn't give everything up. He wanted leniency, but Claire had heard it all before. She wasn't here to negotiate with traffickers. She was here to destroy the empire they built. The task force needed names, operatives still in hiding, still moving people like product, through channels that stretched far beyond the borders. As the investigation advanced, the sheer scope of Torres's influence came into focus. He wasn't just another trafficker. He had ties in law enforcement, in business, in politics. He had built a network designed to thrive in secrecy, a fortress of forged documents, false identities, and institutional silence. These were not small-time criminals. These were professionals, people who could vanish without a trace and leave no trail behind. But Claire refused to back down. She had made a promise to the victims, those who had been silenced, shattered, sold. She would not rest until every link in Torres's chain was broken. Over the following months, progress came slowly but surely. One by one, key associates were tracked down, arrested, and put on trial. Torres's empire, once sprawling and impenetrable, crumbling under the weight of its own depravity. The truth was harrowing. Torres had trafficked humans for years, using every method imaginable. Some victims were lured with promises of work, others with dreams of a better future. Many were simply taken kidnapped and disappeared. Once inside the US, they were sold into slavery. Some ended up in sweatshops, others in brothels. All were stripped of agency, dignity, and hope, but that hope was beginning to return. Thanks to Claire and her team, survivors were walking free. The nightmare was ending. Yet, as the case widened, so did the horror. Each new victim Claire met, each story she heard, felt like another blow. Faces began to blur, but their pain remained sharp. She couldn't stop now. Not when the most dangerous figures were still out there, those with power, money, and everything to lose. The deeper they went, the more corruption they unearthed. The network reached everywhere: O-level smugglers, high-level politicians, even law enforcement insiders. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a shadow system that had operated undetected for years, hiding in plain sight, and it was far from over. Encrypted communications recovered by the task force blew the case wide open. Inside were transport routes, financial trails, and a list of key players, people overseeing every phase of the trafficking chain. The messages revealed an organization built not just on profit, but control. Control over bodies, over lives, over silence. Victims were trafficked from all over the world: Eastern Europe, Asia, South America. They were promised freedom and opportunity. What they got was enslavement, brutality, and complete ERA. SURE. As international cooperation began, law enforcement in Utah linked arms with agencies abroad. This was now a global takedown. But resistance came fast, and from the top power, individuals who would do anything to protect their interests. Still, Claire pushed forward. Every arrest, every file, every lead sheet pursued them all with relentless focus. Her nights became sleepless, her days consumed by evidence, time, patterns. She could feel the cost, but she also knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about bringing down Torres. It was about dismantling an entire ecosystem of exploitation, a structure designed to survive in silence. The deeper they got, the more they realized this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The criminals behind this network weren't just street-level thugs. They were ruthless, resourceful, and willing to do anything to protect their wealth and power. They had deep connections: politicians, business leaders, even law enforcement, and they weren't afraid to use them. What started as an investigation into Victor Torres soon turned into a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Law enforcement worked relentlessly to follow every lead, while the traffickers stayed one step ahead, always watching, always adapting. Claire was more determined than ever, but she wasn't just battling a criminal empire anymore. She was fighting a system of exploitation that had been operating in silence for years. The story of Victor Torres was only the beginning, a fragment of something much larger, a global machine that would take years to fully dismantle. But Claire had made a vow. They would not stop until justice was served, no matter the cost. As the investigation gained momentum, the team uncovered even more horrifying truths. This wasn't just a regional smuggling ring. It was a global enterprise spanning continents, masked behind shell companies, bribed officials, and falsified documents. Victims were trafficked across borders, funneled through hidden routes, and subjected to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and unspeakable violence. Each new lead peeled back another layer of this horrific world. But one realization shook the team to the core. Victor Torres hadn't acted alone. He was part of a vast, organized network. Smugglers transported the victims. Recruiters lured them in with false promises. Corrupt officials cleared the way. And buyers, people with money and influence, bait to exploit human lives without a shred of remorse. And above them all was someone else, a shadowy figure known only as the broker. No one knew their real name, no face, no paper trail, but their influence was unmistakable. This was the architect, the true mastermind. the one who orchestrated the movement of people and profits with chilling precision. The broker had connections in high places, government insiders, corporate executives, even senior law enforcement, people who protected the operation in exchange for a cut. For Claire, it was now clear, finding the broker was the only way to take down the entire syndicate. But the deeper they dug, the darker it got. The investigation revealed a system, not just operating in the shadows, but one that had infiltrated the very institutions meant to stop it. There were whispers of backroom deals, favors exchanged, evidence buried, and cases quietly closed. The traffickers weren't just being protected, they were being enabled. Claire and her team were now fighting on two fronts, exposing the traffickers and the corruption that shielded them. Then came another blow. The team began to suspect a leak. Key details of their investigation were being compromised. The traffickers were too prepared, too informed. Claire could feel the betrayal creeping in someone within their own ranks. Might be feeding information to the other side. The isolation was suffocating, but Claire couldn't afford to stop. Too many lives were on the line. Then, a break. A tip led them to a suspected safe house just outside Salt Lake City. It was late. The air tense. The team moved in swiftly, surrounding the building with weapons. Drawn, Claire's heart pounded. This wasn't just another location, it felt like the location, a place where deals were made, victims were held, and the network's inner circle might finally be exposed. They breached the door. Chaos. Inside were multiple victims shackled, disoriented, terrified, but the traffickers were gone, not a trace, left behind. And then Claire saw it. Scrawled across the wall, in what appeared to be blood, was a single message: "You are too late." It wasn't just a warning, it was a taunt. A message from the broker, reminder that they were always watching, always one move ahead. This was no longer a chase. It was a war. Claire knew the window to stop this was closing fast. Every second they hesitated, more lives were destroyed. More victims disappeared into the void. And yet, she refused to back down. Case 3, Wyoming. The remote expanse of Wyoming, place known for its rugged beauty and quiet independence, a chilling operation was quietly unfolding. It was 2020, and few could have imagined that this isolated corner of America had become the epicenter of a massive human smuggling operation. At the heart of it was Viktor Riznov, a 45-year-old Russian national who had entered the U.S. years earlier under the guise of seeking asylum. Riznov wasn't a man who used violence to control. He used charm, manipulation, strategy. With icy blue eyes and a calculating demeanor, he embedded himself within the trafficking world, blending legitimate businesses with criminal enterprises. He corrupted local officials, built relationships with brokers across the border, and created a seemingly invisible trade route for human lives. His method: precision, deception, silence. Viktor Arnov was a master of blending in. His ability to disappear into the communities around him allowed him to operate in plain sight, undetected for years. Born into poverty in a region riddled with corruption, Viktor learned early how to survive by manipulating the system. By his late 20s, he had become deeply embedded in European criminal organizations, smuggling weapons, trafficking drugs, and eventually, people. He targeted the most vulnerable: migrants fleeing war zones, families desperate for safety, and individuals chasing the dream of a better life. To him, they weren't human, they were product. It didn't take long before Viktor's gaze turned toward the United States. The fractured border enforcement, vast open land, and decentralized law systems made it fertile ground for expansion. Once inside the country, he quietly integrated into small towns, particularly in the West, posing as a hard-working businessman in the hospitality industry. Under various aliases, he launched several businesses: restaurants, motels, and construction firms. On the surface, they appeared legitimate, But behind closed doors, these businesses served as recruitment hubs, way stations, and cover for one of the most expansive human trafficking syndicates in the country. By 2020, RNAV had built a global network. Many of his recruits weren't even aware they were complicit in human trafficking. They thought they were helping immigrants find work or housing. In truth, they were cogs in a machine that commodified human lives. The first cracks in his operation began to show in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Detective Sarah Jensen had been working missing persons cases for over a decade, but something about the recent disappearances in Cheyenne felt different. The missing weren't long-time residents, they were newcomers, immigrants, people just trying to find work. Some were found wandering confused in nearby towns. Most were never seen again. Jensen began connecting the dots. Many of the missing had worked in construction or hospitality specifically for companies that seemed to have shadowy ownership. Local employers spoke of unfamiliar men who oversaw workers but never mingled with the community. Outsiders, anonymous faces in a town that noticed everything. As Jensen dug into business records, a name kept surfacing. Victor Arnov, not always spelled the same, but always linked through false documents, fake shell companies, and layers of obfuscation. It became clear this wasn't a local operation. This was systemic. The turning point came from a construction firm in Jackson Hole, known for building luxury homes for wealthy clients. Many of the workers appeared malnourished, overworked, and terrified. Those who escaped shared gut stories of forced labor, confinement, and relentless control. Some had been trafficked into sexual exploitation. Others were moved under cover of darkness, housed in silence, and worked into submission. Victor didn't act alone. He had loyal enforcers, many of whom had followed him since his early days in Europe. These individuals moved the victims, enforced discipline, and kept the operation running with military precision. If someone posed a threat, they were dealt with quietly and permanently. As Jensen pushed forward, the FBI took notice. They'd been tracking similar trafficking routes across the country and saw Ranav's footprints stretching across state lines. His was no longer just a Wyoming case, it was part of something much bigger. Still, Victor stayed a step ahead. He grew more cautious, relocating to more remote areas, abandoning compromised locations, and using Wyoming's vast backcountry to disappear. But the deeper Jensen went, the more disturbing the truth became. RNAV wasn't just running a trafficking ring. He had embedded himself into the economic fabric of Wyoming. His businesses weren't just covers, they were essential parts of the community. Motels, diners, construction companies on paper. He was a model entrepreneur. In reality, these were waypoints of horror. Each business had legitimate customers, but behind the scenes, trafficked individuals were cycled in and out. They were told they owed debts, transport fees, housing, job placement costs. The only way to repay them was through endless labor. There was no end, no escape. Some were forced into construction. Others cleaned motel rooms. A few were pushed into sex work. Most didn't even know what state they were in. Their identities were erased. Their existence hidden in rural towns where no one asked questions. Initially, the FBI hesitated to divert major resources to Wyoming. But as Jensen's evidence mounted, the scale and brutality of the operation became undeniable. It had reached national attention, and time was running out. Then came the break. A man named Antonio Morales walked into the Cheyenne police station. A former enforcer for Arnov, Antonio had spent nearly 2 years helping move and control victims. But over time, guilt began to gnaw at him. After witnessing the death of a trafficked woman under suspicious circumstances, something inside him snapped. He wanted out, and he was ready to talk. Antonio described hidden warehouses, smuggling routes, communication drop points, and safe houses. One warehouse, buried deep in Wyoming's foothills, became the new focal point. It was registered to a fake company, and operated only at night. Surveillance confirmed it. Unmarked vans came and went. Disoriented individuals were brought in, some resisting, others numb. No one stayed long. They were processed, then sent elsewhere. Authorities prepared for a takedown. What they would find inside would haunt them forever. Antonio Morales had seen enough. After years working inside Victor Arnav's trafficking network, witnessing the relentless abuse of women and children, he could no longer live with the guilt, fearful for his life, yet driven by a need for redemption. He came forward ready to reveal everything. His testimony became the turning point in the case. Antonio exposed the intricate web of Victor Arnav's operation, how victims were transported, how they were controlled, and the many layers of exploitation they endured. He also named key players, some with unsettling ties to local law enforcement. With this information, Detective Jensen and her team finally had what they needed to strike. The raid was swift. Under the cover of darkness, FBI agents and local officers surrounded the warehouse. Every second Maturdanov was known to flee at the slightest sign of danger. As they breached the doors, they were met with an eerie silence. Inside were rows of cages, makeshift sleeping quarters, and the haunting emptiness of cells once occupied. Some victims were still there, others were gone. What they uncovered left no doubt this was a meticulously organized trafficking hub, but Victor Arnav was nowhere to be found. Once again, he had vanished, likely tipped off by one of his loyal enforcers. Despite his escape, the operation had been severely crippled. Agents recovered troves of evidence, ledgers, trafficking route maps, encrypted communications, and a list of high-ranking collaborators. The victims were taken to safety, given medical care and support. For the first time in years, they were free. But the cost of that freedom was immeasurable. As weeks passed, authorities worked around the clock to identify those involved. Many of Arnav's top associates were captured, but Arnav himself remained a ghost, always one step ahead. Rumors suggested he'd fled the country. Others claimed he'd disappeared into the wilderness of Wyoming. His empire was shattered, but the man behind it had slipped through their fingers. The case would go down in history as one of the largest human trafficking busts in U.S. history. For Detective Jensen, however, it was a bittersweet victory. Dozens had been rescued. Too many were still missing. Too many stories left untold. Late one evening, as Jensen reviewed final reports at her desk, her phone rang. It was Antonio Morales. He was rattled. His voice shook as he explained that he'd received a warning, an anonymous message suggesting someone was looking for him. Even in witness protection, he felt exposed. "I thought I was safe," he told her, "but I'm not so sure anymore." Jensen's stomach sank. She tried to reassure him, but deep down she knew the truth. Victor Arnav's network had been massive, far-reaching, and adaptable, and its remnants were still out there. The survivors haunted her thoughts. Though the raid had freed many, countless others were still trapped, hidden in plain sight. Arnav had built a system so intricate it was almost impossible to untangle. She'd seen the fear in their eyes, heard their stories. Many had been lured with promises of jobs and opportunity, only to be thrown into a life of degradation. Some were kidnapped. Others were sold into slavery by desperate family members. One survivor Jensen would never forget was a 16-year-old girl named Maria, promised a hotel job. She had arrived in Wyoming, hopeful only to find herself forced to clean motel rooms used for illicit purposes. When she tried to escape, Arnav's enforcers brutalized her. Her defiance was met with cruelty, her pain used as a warning to others. But Maria survived. When she was finally rescued, she clung to the smallest ember of hope. She wanted justice, Nate, just for herself, but for others still out there. Her testimony would prove instrumental in prosecuting members of the network. Over the following months, Jensen and the FBI pursued every lead. They arrested dozens more, suspects and uncovered additional links to trafficking routes spanning from Wyoming to California, Nevada, and Texas. Still, RNAV remained out of reach. He had built more than just a trafficking ring. He had created a shadow infrastructure, bribed officials, paid off officers, a network of enforcers ready to die for him. Even after his operation crumbled, pieces of it lingered in the shadows, waiting to regroup. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the whispers that some freed survivors were at risk of being re-trafficked. The network hadn't died, it had adapted, changed its face, shifted its methods. Arnav's absence had created a power vacuum, and others were all too willing to step in. The fight wasn't over. Detective Jensen knew the road ahead was long. Healing would take years. Justice might never reach every victim. But one truth endured. The survivors were no longer voiceless. They had fought back. They had endured. And now, with the world watching, they would never be forgotten. Despite the arrests, despite the dismantling of Victor Rav's trafficking empire, the war was far from over. Members of Rav's network were still out there, and worse, they were targeting the very people who had been rescued. Survivors, some barely beginning to heal, were being hunted, manipulated, and coerced with false promises of safety or insidious threats meant to drag them back into the life they had fought so hard to escape. Detective Jensen knew this wasn't just about criminal justice anymore, it was about survival. She worked closely with organizations that specialized in supporting trafficking survivors, making sure each one had access to counseling, secure housing, legal aid, and if necessary, new identities. Some survivors were placed in safety, others simply vanished into protective custody. But even then, time was not on their side. The longer they stayed hidden, the more likely they were to be found. Rav's operation had collapsed, but his influence hadn't vanished. It lingered like smoke after a fire, toxic and persistent. And Jensen, relentless as ever, was committed to chasing justice. Not just for the survivors, but for every soul that had been caught in Rav's web. Because she understood a chilling truth. The case wasn't over. Not even close. They had captured Rav, but they hadn't captured everything. As more victims came forward and new evidence emerged, it became clear that what they had uncovered was just the surface, just the outer shell of a much larger and more insidious network. Rav's so-called empire had been built on lies, silence, and systemic corruption. And though his downfall was a victory, it was also just the beginning. Weeks turned into months. The urgency never faded. Calls and anonymous tips poured in, each more disturbing than the last. Survivors spoke of others still enslaved, of new smuggling routes crossing state lines, of networks that had learned how to operate in the shadows, evolving, adapting. The case had grown beyond trafficking. It was now about control, deep institutional control, one that reached into law enforcement, politics, and every layer of society. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Jensen sat alone in her office, poring over old case files, when the door creaked open. She looked up and froze. Antonio Morales stood there. He looked different, thinner, drawn, but the haunted look in his eyes was unmistakable. "Jensen," he said quietly, "I've been hearing things about Rav." She motioned for him to sit. She had expected this moment eventually. Antonio had once been part of Rav's inner circle. He'd seen the operation from the inside. If anyone was being watched, being pressured, being drawn back in, it would be him. "Tell me everything," she said. He hesitated, eyes distant, as if his mind was elsewhere. Then finally, he spoke. "They're not gone, Jensen. Not completely. Rav's people. ... They're regrouping. They're trying to rebuild. And I think someone new is taking charge, someone worse." Jensen's stomach tightened. Antonio continued, his voice dry and heavy. "They're not just trafficking anymore. They're smuggling people across borders into Canada, into Mexico. They've got fake charities, online ads, even real businesses as fronts. People don't even realize they're being traffficked ... until it's too late. Jensen knew what this meant. Rav had been clever, but the new players were smarter, faster, and more ruthless. They weren't just rebuilding his empire, they were reinventing it. How do we stop them? She asked, though deep down, she already knew the answer. There would be no single raid, no quick resolution. It'll take years, Antonio muttered. Decades maybe. But they're watching me. I can feel it. I can't stay here much longer. Jensen leaned back, absorbing the weight of his words. We'll have to go deeper, she murmured. Infiltrate them again. Find out who's really running the show. Antonio stared at her, stunned. Are you serious? After everything that's already happened? She didn't blink. Yes, because if we don't stop them now, they'll only get stronger. After a long pause, Antonio nodded. I'll help, he said quietly. But I don't trust anyone anymore. Jensen understood. Betrayal, manipulation, violence, it all left scars. But she also knew Antonio's insight was a rare asset. He knew how the system worked, and he was the key to taking it down for good. In the days that followed, Jensen assembled her team. Together they strategized how to infiltrate the network. They identified targets, tracked financial trails, and collaborated with federal agencies. But every hour spent planning was another hour the traffickers used to expand. Jensen never lost sight of the victims. She thought of them every day, their faces, their stories, their pain. Some had begun to heal. Maria, the terrified girl who once could barely speak above a whisper, had become a symbol of hope. She shared her story, inspired others, and reminded the world that survival was possible. Her courage sparked change, but Jensen also knew that, for every Maria, countless others remained in the shadows, voiceless and lost. Victor Rav's empire might have fallen, but the darkness he unleashed had not, and Jensen wasn't done. She would keep fighting case by case, survivor by survivor, till every chain was broken and every trafficker was brought to justice. The rest of the world might forget the name Resnov, but for Jensen, the battle had only just begun. The hours Jensen had spent buried in case files had only sharpened her determination. Every new clue, every lead that filtered in, only solidified her resolve. She knew exactly what these traffickers were capable of. She knew they wouldn't stop. Not now. Not when there were whispers that someone worse than Arnov had taken the reins. But as she sat alone in her dimly lit office, the weight of it all began to settle in. Something didn't sit right. The operation had unraveled too quickly after Arnov's arrest, and despite the chaos, the network hadn't crumbled, it had shifted, morphed, adapted. This wasn't over, not even close, and Jensen wasn't the only one who felt the storm brewing. Antonio, though reluctant, had agreed to help. His insights weren't just valuable, they were essential. He knew the inner workings of the trafficking world, had lived in the shadows of Arnov's empire. Turning his back on that life wasn't a decision he'd taken lightly. Days after their conversation, Jensen began laying the groundwork. The first step, infiltration. The only way in was through Antonio's old contacts. Men still tied to the former regime. Antonio insisted their best lead was through a middleman named Thomas Roar, a man notorious for running underground gambling rings and laundering his profits through a maze of illegal ventures. Not much to go on, but sometimes. All it took was one crack to split open the entire wall. The night Jensen met Antonio at the diner felt heavier than most. It was late. The place was quiet, save for a few staff wrapping up their shifts. Antonio looked, worn, his clothes hung loosely, and his face bore the strain of years of regret. He agreed to meet, he said, sliding into the booth across from her. But I don't trust him. Roar doesn't do favors for cops. Jensen nodded, already prepared for the danger ahead. Nothing about this mission was ever going to be easy. We keep it quiet, she said, but we move fast. We need to know what he knows, and we need it now. The meeting was set for the following night to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The perfect place for a quiet exchange, or a deadly ambush. They arrived just before midnight. The air was sharp, the silence pierced only by distant highway traffic. Antonio walked with the confidence of someone who knew these streets. Jensen followed, every sense on high alert. The warehouse was cloaked in shadows. Dust hung in the stale air, and every echo of their footsteps felt like a warning. At first it seemed empty, but then, from the gloom, a figure stepped forward. Thomas, Roar. He was exactly what Jensen expected. Scarred, hardened, eyes cold and watchful. A predator. You two come here often. Roar's voice was low and laced with mockery. Jensen didn't blink. We're here for business, looking to buy information. Roar arched a brow, intrigued but unconvinced. I don't deal in valuable, sweetheart. I deal in facts. Real ones. So what's your angle? Antonio stepped in. We're looking into a new network. The one that emerged after RNA. At the mention of the name, Roar's eyes flickered. A crack in the mask. He knew something. Roar leaned against a crate, arms folded. You think I'm just gonna spill it? People watch me. I don't talk unless there's a good reason. Jensen met his gaze. We have what you want, but we don't hand it over unless you talk. Who's behind this new operation? Where are they running things? He hesitated. For a moment, silence, then he stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper. There's a new player, worse than RNAV, smarter. They're running people through places no one would think to check underground hidden routes. And they're not working alone. They've got people on the inside, ... Cops, politicians. It's bigger than you think. Jensen felt a chill. This wasn't just trafficking. This was infiltration. Corruption at the highest levels, as they left. The warehouse, Roar's words echoed in her mind. It's bigger than you think. Antonio broke the silence in the car. Do you realize what this means? His eyes scanned the rearview mirror, half expecting a tale. Jensen nodded. We're not just dealing with criminals. We're up against a system now. Antonio slammed the dashboard, frustration boiling. Over. We were so focused on our nav, we missed what was coming next. But we still have time. Jensen's thoughts raced. The routes Roar mentioned, they weren't just for smuggling people. They were pipelines for money, power, influence. This thing's infected the whole system, she said. And if we don't stop it, no one will. They drove in silence, the road ahead dark and uncertain. But one thing was clear: what they had uncovered was only the beginning. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become. They didn't know exactly what they were walking into, but walking away was no longer an option. The stakes had shifted. Lives were on the line. By the time they reached their temporary safe house, dawn was breaking. A soft glow touched the horizon, casting long shadows over the city below. Inside, Jensen's mind buzzed with everything they'd uncovered so far. The emergence of a new player, whispers of underground routes, and the powerful figures operating behind the scenes. It all pointed to something much bigger than they'd imagined. But the pieces didn't fit yet. Antonio wasted no time. He was already working his contacts, scouring for intel on the smuggling routes Roar had mentioned. Jensen sat hunched over, her laptop files spread across the table, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to link names, dates, and movements. Time blurred. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional mutter or the clack of keys. The deeper they dug, the more alarming the truth became. This wasn't just a trafficking operation. It was an institution, a machine, and someone had built it to be nearly untouchable. Then her phone rang. Jensen glanced at the screen and froze. Roar Jensen, he said, skipping the pleasantries. I've got more, but we meet tonight. Her pulse quickened. Where? There's an old pier just outside the city. I'll send you the coordinates." The line went dead before she could reply. She stood, already knowing they had no choice. Antonio, still on the phone, paused mid-sentence. He looked at her and nodded grimly. "You sure?" he asked. Jensen nodded once. "We need to hear what he has. We go in, get what we need, and we're out. No mistakes." They moved fast. Essentials only: firearms, burner phones, fake IDs. As they drove toward the pier, a nagging feeling tightened in Jensen's chest. Roar's timing was too convenient. He had answers maybe, but he also played his own game. Was this a lead or a trap? The pier was abandoned. The wind whispered across rusted shipping containers, and the water slapped softly against the docks. As they stepped out of the car, a lone figure stood near the edge, just a silhouette against the faint shimmer of city lights in the distance. Roar Jensen's hand hovered near her holster. She didn't trust him, not completely. "Where is it?" she asked coldly. He smirked. "You'll get it if you hear me out." Jensen kept her stance, eyes narrowed. "I've been running a parallel op," Roar began. "Same as you. But this new player, this system, they own everyone. Cops, judges, politicians. If you're going to win, you've got to stop thinking like law enforcement." "What do you mean?" Jensen asked. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not fighting criminals anymore. You're fighting the system. To beat them, you'll have to get your hands dirty." Jensen's mind spun. This wasn't just human trafficking. It was a power structure, a web of influence. "Tell me," she demanded. Roar pulled a small envelope from his coat and handed it to her. "This is just the start," he said. "But if you want to go higher, you'll need leverage." Jensen opened the envelope. Inside was a list of powerful names: judges, politicians, high-ranking law enforcement, every one of them connected to the trafficking network. This was it. "Now get out of here," Roar said, voice colder now. "Don't come back unless you've got something worth my time." Jensen turned and walked away, Antonio at her side. They had what they came for, but the real work had only just begun. Case 4. Kingston upon Hullen, the port city of Kingston upon Hull, better known simply as Hull, hidden beneath the hum of industry and trade. A dark trade flourished. Human trafficking. It had grown quietly, carefully, in the shadows. It didn't make headlines, not at first, but if you looked closely, the signs were there, and at the center of it all was a man no one saw coming. Victor Klov. To the outside world, Victor was unremarkable, an immigrant with a quiet life, working modest jobs, blending into the background. But beneath that facade, he was the mastermind of one of the most ruthless trafficking syndicates the UK had ever seen. His reach extended far beyond Hull and to other cities, across Europe, deep into the underworld. He was a ghost in the system, sharp-featured, soft-spoken, calculating. He had a gift for manipulation, for disarming trust. Victor's operation relied on a carefully constructed network. Recruiters scouted impoverished towns across Eastern Europe, offering false promises: jobs. In the UK, fresh starts, clean wages. Desperation made the pitch easy. Once aboard, the victims were herded into unsafe, overcrowded transports. The promise: work a better life. The reality: modern-day slavery. Upon arriving in Hull, the illusion shattered. Victims were sold into brothels, illegal factories, and sweatshops. They were stripped of ID, freedom, and dignity. Any attempt to escape was met with brutal consequences, often not just for them, but for family members back home. Victor had crafted a system built on fear and control. The port became his gateway. Among legitimate goods, people were moved in and out netted. His structure was so seamless. Even law enforcement struggled to connect the dots. Until 2023. That year, Detective Sarah Bennett started to put the puzzle together. a veteran of the whole police force. Bennett had long felt something was wrong. Missing persons reports, undocumented foreign workers, cases that vanished without a trace didn't add up, while others dismissed them as coincidence. Bennett saw a pattern. She began her own off-the-books investigation, speaking to communities others had ignored. Piece by piece, she uncovered something chilling. These people weren't vanishing, they were being taken, and someone was orchestrating the entire thing. That name surfaced, slowly, Victor Klov. As she dug deeper, the scale of his operation came into focus. What Bennett had discovered was not just one man's crime, it was a network, and it was protected by silence, fear, and in some cases, corruption. But she wasn't going to back down, and the empire Victor had built, it was about to be exposed. Despite her tireless efforts, gathering solid evidence against Victor Klov had proven nearly impossible. He was always a step ahead, careful, calculating, shielded by a network that ran deeper than anyone imagined. The breakthrough came from a young woman named Elena, one of Victor's victims, who managed to escape from a brothel in Hull. Elena was from a quiet village in Romania, lured to the UK with promises of work as a waitress. But the reality was far darker. Upon arrival, she was sold into sexual slavery, forced to endure unimaginable abuse in a world where escape seemed impossible. But Elena was resilient. After months of captivity, she seized an opportunity and fled into the night, barefoot and terrified, through the cold streets of Hull. She eventually reached the local authorities, her voice trembling, but determined. Her testimony cracked the case wide open. For the first time, police had a first-hand account of what was really happening behind closed doors. Elena's courage gave Detective Sarah Bennett the critical lead she needed, but Bennett knew that taking down Victor wouldn't be simple. He wasn't just a trafficker, he was protected by powerful allies, individuals with money, influence, and everything to lose. This wasn't just a criminal case anymore, it was a war against a deeply entrenched network. Bennett assembled a dedicated task force, officers and investigators, as determined as she was to bring justice. They scoured Hull, tracking down victims, piecing together stories, tracing transportation routes, identifying businesses complicit in the trade. They uncovered the system Victor had built, how the victims were moved, controlled, and sold into various forms of exploitation. The operation slowly began to unravel. Arrests followed, recruiters, transporters, handlers, and corrupt enablers. But Victor remained out of reach. Paranoid and evasive, he knew the walls were closing in. He vanished from public view, orchestrating his empire from the shadows. It wasn't until the fall of 2024 that Bennett's team finally tracked him down. Victor was hiding in a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of Hull, disguised in rural silence, continuing to pull strings from a distance. The raid was swift, brutal, and final. Victor Klov was captured, and with him, a monstrous empire began to crumble, but the damage he'd done extended far beyond Hull. The investigation revealed a massive trafficking network that spanned across Europe, Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, and beyond. Thousands of victims, many deceived by the promise of a better life, had been funneled through this system. Some ended up in brothels, others in factories and warehouses, working under brutal conditions for little or no pay. Many had their passports seized the moment they arrived. Others were subjected to physical abuse, psychological torture, and threats to their families back home. Victor's reach had infected businesses throughout Wholesome, knowingly complicit. Others bribed or coerced into silence. His trafficking ring had become a hidden part of the city's economy, embedded in its very infrastructure. The scope of what Bennett uncovered was staggering. This was not a simple trafficking case. This was industrialized exploitation, powered by desperation and sustained by corruption. Even after Victor's arrest, the work didn't stop. Bennett and her team pressed on, determined to bring every last collaborator to justice. The victims, though deeply scarred, had found their voice, and in telling their stories, they helped dismantle one of the most dangerous trafficking rings in the UK. In the end, Victor Clav was sentenced to life in prison. His empire built on deception, abuse, and pain was shattered. The case marked a turning point in the fight against human trafficking, not just in Hull, but across Europe. A grim reminder of how deeply exploitation can take root and how vital it is to fight back. For Detective Bennett, it was never just about the arrests. It was about restoring dignity to the survivors and exposing a system that had thrived in silence for far too long. No matter how deep Bennett dug into the operation, Victor remained a ghost. His connections, his wealth, his uncanny ability to vanish, all of it made him nearly untouchable. He laundered money through a maze of shell companies and legitimate businesses, silencing threats with cold cash. Worse, Bennett was certain. He had friends inside the local police, a fact that filled her with both frustration and fury. As the investigation dragged on, Bennett began to lose herself in it. Long nights, unrelenting pressure, and the constant awareness that Victor was always a step ahead were taking a toll. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Lives were at stake, countless victims counting on someone to fight for them. One night, buried in hours of old surveillance footage from the docks, Bennett spotted something, a detail that had been missed. Blurry at first, a man talking with one of Victor's known enforcers. The exchange seemed casual, forgettable even, but there was something about the man, not his face, that was too indistinct. It was the way he moved, the way he stood. It was familiar, trained, controlled. The kind of body language Bennett had seen in Insiders, people who knew how to vanish in plain sight. She froze the frame, zoomed in. Still no ID, but instinct told her this man mattered. The team got to work. Weeks passed before they identified him. Jack Thompson, a local low-level enforcer who had operated under the radar for years. Thompson had his hands in everything: smuggling, extortion, intimidation. But more importantly, he was deeply embedded in Victor's trafficking network. Logistics, transport, control. Thompson ran it all. If a victim tried to run, Thompson ensured they were found and punished. With Thompson now in their sights, Bennett's team built their case piece by piece. Surveillance, financial records, intercepted calls. Eventually, they uncovered a critical lead. Thompson was coordinating a major shipment of victims in the coming weeks. It was the break they'd been waiting for. The operation to dismantle Victor's network was greenlit. Arrests were planned for Thompson and his crew. But the real objective was Victor. Catching him wouldn't be easy. It never was. But this time, they had a chance. The raid was prepared, with military precision. Undercover agents, armed tactical units, elite detectives, all briefed, all ready. Bennett's heart pounded as word came through. They had surrounded Victor's hideout in the command center. Eyes fixed to the screens, Bennett watched it all unfold. This was it. The culmination of years of work, sacrifice, and near obsession. They had tracked Victor's empire from the brothels to the back alleys, from the warehouses to the hidden safe houses across Hull and beyond. Victor had corrupted an entire city. His reign of fear had reached into every layer of society, and yet, Bennett still wondered how many had known and said nothing, how many had helped him thrive simply by looking the other way. Victor was a master of shadows. Every transaction was in cash. Every order passed through layers of intermediaries. He never left fingerprints, only scars. But now, the walls were closing in. The team was in place. Officers covered every exit. No one would leave unnoticed. Then the radios crackled to life. The raid was on. Officers stormed the warehouse, a decaying structure on Hull's outskirts, converted into a fortress. High walls, locked doors, layers of security. But the team had studied the blueprints. They knew every corner, room by room. Officers cleared the building. Bennett, watching from the screens, could feel the tension through the glass. Victor was dangerous, and fear was his greatest weapon. Even now, he inspired silence from those who once served him. Would he be there? Time dragged. Then, a voice on the radio. Second floor breached. Multiple associates found hiding in a rear room. Arrests made, but no Victor. Bennett's stomach dropped. Then, another call. A hidden staircase. A way down. One that wasn't on any map. It led to the basement. The passageway had been expertly hidden, absent from any of the blueprints the team had reviewed. It led to a network of underground tunnels, Victor Clav's escape routes. The officers, though, momentarily stunned, knew they had no choice but to pursue him. No matter how long it took, they couldn't risk letting Victor disappear again. They descended into the depths beneath Hull, flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. The tunnel system was narrow, winding like the veins of the city itself. Every step deeper confirmed what they had feared. Victor hadn't just built an empire above ground, he had rooted it deep within Hull's foundations. Back in the command center, Sarah Bennett monitored the operation, anxiety clawing at her. It was a race against time. Victor had always been a step ahead, and if they didn't catch him now, they might never get another chance. The air grew colder the farther the team went. Dampness clung to the walls. Their boots echoed in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an endless descent, they reached a large, cavernous chamber. Crates and sealed boxes were stacked high, likely filled with the illicit goods Victor had trafficked. And there, half hidden among the cargo, was Victor Clav. Gone was the sharp, polished man who once sat atop a criminal empire. He looked worn, his carefully maintained appearance eroded by months on the run. But his eyes, they were still cold, calculating, dangerous. When he saw the officers, instinct took over. He tried to flee, but there was nowhere left to run. He was surrounded. The mask slipped. For the first time, fear crossed Victor's face. Fear Bennett had always known was his driving force. He wasn't the untouchable kingpin anymore. He was a man cornered, exposed. The team moved fast, securing Victor and escorting him out of the tunnels. He was placed under arrest for human trafficking, forced labor, and a litany of other charges. The raid was a success, but Bennett knew this was just the beginning. There were still victims out there, still people whose lives had been torn apart by Victor's web of cruelty. As she watched him being loaded into the police van, Bennett felt no triumph. The terror Victor had inflicted on Hull and beyond was ending, but the scars he left would remain for years. As the last officers cleared the scene, Bennett stood alone in the dim command center. The glow of the monitors flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The radios had gone silent, but the quiet was anything but comforting. Victor's arrest had brought a monster to justice, but it had also uncovered something massive. A human trafficking network that stretched beyond Hull's borders. What haunted Bennett wasn't just the scale of the operation, it was the countless victims, the lives ruined in silence. One of the younger officers entered, face pale with fatigue. In his hand, a file. He laid it quietly on her desk. "We've got the list, detective," he said. Bennett opened it, scanning the pages. Names. Dozens. Some local, others from distant countries. All connected by the same nightmare victims of Victor Clav's empire. Some had vanished years ago, others more recently. Each name carried a story of suffering. She closed the file slowly, the weight of it heavy in her hands. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. Victor's arrest was only the first battle in a much longer war. There would be court proceedings, deeper investigations, and the hardest task of all, helping the survivors heal. Because locking Victor away didn't fix what had already been broken. The wounds he caused couldn't be erased by a conviction. The trafficking system he exploited ran deeper than one man. It was systemic, insidious, and Victor wasn't alone. Others would rise, trying to fill the vacuum he left behind. The danger wasn't gone, it had only changed shape. But for now, Victor Clav was where he belonged, behind bars, his empire crumbling piece by piece. Bennett made her way to the holding area, where Victor sat waiting for interrogation. He looked different now, no longer the smug puppet master who had danced around justice for years. His confidence had fractured. Fatigue lined his face. He seemed smaller somehow. "He's not going to talk," one officer murmured as she entered. "Not unless we give him something to bargain with." Bennett nodded, then took a seat across from Victor. Their eyes locked. He studied her, trying to regain control of the moment. But Bennett had long since learned how this game worked. She didn't blink. "You must be wondering what comes next," she said evenly. Victor's eyes flickered, fear maybe, or defiance. "Hard to tell. I know what comes next," he said at last. "The system will try to break me, but it won't. Not like the others." Bennett leaned forward, voice calm and cold. "You still don't get it. This isn't about breaking you. This is about stopping you, ending what you built, ending the harm." Victor went silent. She could see the tension in his jaw, the war raging behind his eyes, whether to stay quiet or try to save himself with a deal. Finally, he spoke. "I won't give you names. Not unless you promise me something." Bennett raised an eyebrow. She had expected this. Victor was a strategist, to the end, trying to bargain, even now. But she wasn't here to make deals, not with men like him. He offered her no promises. She replied, calm but firm. He responded with a cold chuckle, a sound devoid of humor. "Then I suppose we have nothing more to talk about." Detective Sarah Bennett stood up. The interrogation was over. Victor Clough had made his choice, and though she respected it, it didn't make walking away any easier. Still, there was work to do. His silence wouldn't stop her. The months that followed blurred into a storm of courtrooms, witness testimonies, and endless paperwork. Victor Clough's trial became a media frenzy, attracting global attention. But amid the cameras and headlines, something more powerful emerged. The voices of the victims. Once hidden in the shadows, they came forward to tell their stories. Tales of horror, of lives stolen, children sold to the highest bidder, and families shattered by an empire built on suffering. Bennett attended every session. She listened. She endured, because their pain deserved to be heard. Justice had a price, and it was often paid in truth. Raw, unflinching truth. Victor never showed remorse. That was expected. But as the final verdict was read, and he was led away in handcuffs, something changed. His mask of defiance cracked, and in his eyes, Bennett finally saw it. Fear. He had once ruled an empire, but now he was just another criminal. His power stripped. His name forever tied to pain. Victor Clough's reign was over, and while the scars he left would take years to heal, Sarah Bennett had done what she set out to do. She played her part in bringing justice to the forgotten. As she walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the case still on her shoulders, Bennett allowed herself one moment, a breath of peace. But peace was temporary. Victor's trial was only one chapter in a much larger, more disturbing story. His arrest had exposed something deeper, a global trafficking network, tightly woven into the fabric of international commerce. The real work was just beginning. Each evening, the faces of the survivors stayed with her. Children, parents, people destroyed by a system that had failed to protect them. Their stories haunted her, reminders that she could not let their suffering be forgotten. The net around Richard's remaining associates was tightening. With their leader behind bars, they had grown paranoid, aware that the authorities were closing in. The task force expanded its investigation beyond Australia, reaching into the international web Richard had helped create. Federal agents coordinated with law enforcement in Thailand, the Philippines, and Eastern Europe, exchanging intelligence and resources. Dismantling a global trafficking network would require cooperation across borders. Richard's arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. His name became infamous, etched into history as the mastermind behind one of Australia's largest human trafficking rings. While his downfall marked a victory for law enforcement, it also cast a grim light on the scale of the trafficking crisis, still lurking in the shadows. Hidden behind closed doors, behind fake job offers, and quiet transactions, exploitation persisted and always would, unless vigilance remained constant. For the survivors, freedom was only the beginning. Many faced an uncertain future. Some were able to find work in legitimate sectors. Others were reunited with family members they hadn't seen in years. The scars of their ordeal would never fully fade, but they had survived. And now, finally, they were free. Richard was eventually sentenced to life in prison, but no sentence could measure the weight of the suffering he caused. Families were destroyed, lives shattered, identities stolen. His legacy was one of calculated cruelty and human exploitation. Yet the survivors of his operation, those who broke free and chose to speak out, proved that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could endure. The first threads of the operation began to unravel when several escapees came forward. Their testimonies revealed a harrowing network of deception and abuse. Most had been lured from impoverished areas across Southeast Asia, enticed by false promises of safety, dignity, and a fresh start. Instead, they found themselves ensnared in a brutal system that thrived on fear and submission. But Richard had not built this empire alone. At the heart of the next phase of the investigation was Adrian Holbrook, a middle-aged man who had successfully embedded himself into Hobart's business community. On the surface, Holbrook appeared harmless. He claimed to be a quiet property developer with a modest portfolio. Few questioned how a man of such humble origins had acquired so many assets, or how he kept such a low profile. In truth, Holbrook's interest in real estate was only a cover. His ascent through the world of human trafficking was slow, deliberate, and disturbingly sophisticated. He had mastered the art of deception, using fake documents and multiple identities to obscure his true intentions. Behind closed doors, he was building something far more sinister, a pipeline of human cargo, flowing into Australia under the guise of opportunity. Tasmania, remote, quiet, and often overlooked, offered the perfect staging ground. Its industries were hungry for cheap labor, yet Australia's immigration policies made legal entry difficult. Holbrook exploited this imbalance, reaching out to contacts in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand. He crafted a carefully worded sales pitch. Come to Australia, work, earn, build a better life. The reality was a nightmare. Once inside Australia, victims were handed over to enforcers. Many ended up on fishing boats, in factories, or working dangerous jobs on remote farms. Those who resisted were beaten, threatened, broken. Holbrook ensured his hands stayed clean, delegating the violence to others. Yet his involvement was absolute. Every transaction, every movement, every fabricated identity bore his fingerprints. He had help. And among his most critical allies was Olivia Grant-a-Savvy, charismatic fixer who understood the system inside and out. Olivia had once worked in various sectors across Hobart and had built a reputation as a respected businesswoman. Her public persona was impeccably polished, generous, philanthropic. But beneath that surface lay a ruthless strategist. Olivia managed the safe houses where victims were held. She coordinated transport, silenced whistleblowers, and ensured that no loose ends threatened the operation. In certain circles, her involvement in the trafficking ring was an open secret. Those close to her knew better than to ask questions. If someone talked, she was the one who made sure they disappeared through coercion, threats, or worse. Her charm was a weapon, her connections a shield. She moved through high society with ease, while orchestrating some of the darkest abuses imaginable. And with her help, Holbrook's trafficking empire flourished until it didn't. As the task force widened its scope, more raids were conducted, more victims rescued, and more perpetrators unmasked. Each arrest peeled back another layer of the operation's disturbing complexity. The public was horrified by the extent of the exploitation and devastated to learn that some members of local law enforcement had been complicit, bribed into silence or active cooperation. It was a betrayal that would take years to repair, but change had begun. Survivors were beginning to reclaim their lives. Advocacy groups offered them shelter, counseling, and hope, and for the first time in a long while, they had a voice, one that would not be silenced again. The cracks in Holbrook's empire first appeared when a young woman named Mia managed to escape during a routine transfer. Originally from Indonesia, Mia had arrived in Australia, lured by promises of stable work and a brighter future. But what she found instead was a nightmare. Forced into grueling labor on a farm outside Hobart, she worked 16-hour days with barely enough food, no rest days, and only meager paypenny. Mia quickly realized that this wasn't just exploitation, it was slavery. She knew that staying meant one of three things: illness, injury, or death. And so, one night, in a rare moment of distraction by her captors, Mia made her move. She ran, barefoot through the dark countryside, terrified, alone, and without money or ID. She eventually reached a police station, exhausted, bruised, and barely able to speak. But her story shocked local officers. Mia's testimony painted a harrowing picture of modern-day slavery, hidden in plain sight. And as investigators began digging, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. What she'd escaped was part of a far larger, deeply embedded network, one that had been operating under the radar for years. At the heart of it all was Adrian Holbrook, a seemingly respectable businessman in Hobart. Holbrook had embedded himself within the fabric of the city, investing in property, attending charity events, shaking hands with politicians. But behind the scenes, he was the architect of one of Tasmania's largest human trafficking networks, and his partner in the operation, Olivia Grant. Elegant, poised, and deeply connected, Olivia managed the logistics, safe houses, transportation, and most crucially, silence. Together, Holbrook and Olivia had built an empire that spanned international borders. They sourced victims from countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, regions where poverty left families vulnerable to promises of hope. Victims were told they'd find legitimate work in Australia. What they got instead was slavery. Workers were shipped to construction sites, fishing vessels, and remote farms. Their documents were taken, their identities erased, and any sign of rebellion was swiftly met with punishment. Holbrook never got his hands dirty. Instead, he relied on layers of intermediaries, fixers, corrupt officials, even members of law enforcement to keep the machine running. Olivia ensured that silence was bought or forced, but Mia's escape lit a fuse. Her courage inspired others. Slowly, more victims stepped forward, each one adding to the growing mountain of evidence. Every testimony revealed another layer of the network's brutality and reach. Police began mapping out connections, offshore bank accounts, encrypted communications, forged documents, and silent accomplices. Months of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work followed. And finally, the empire crumbled. Adrian Holbrook was arrested and charged with human trafficking, slavery, and running an organized criminal enterprise. Olivia Grant was also taken into custody, her cold efficiency laid bare in court. The trial was one of the most complex and emotionally charged in Tasmanian legal history. Survivors testified, some through tears, others with unwavering resolve. Holbrook was sentenced to life in prison. Olivia received a lengthy term as well. Their downfall marked a turning point, not just for the victims, but for the region. The investigation became a model for how to dismantle sophisticated trafficking rings and shed light on an issue so often kept in the shadows. But even as Tasmania reeled from the revelations, the world was learning of an even larger operation, thousands of kilometers away. In 2016, a human trafficking ring spanning much of Southeast Asia was exposed, shocking the world with its sheer size and cruelty. At the center of it was Wei Jiao, a seemingly ordinary businessman from Fujian Province, China. Outwardly, he was a respected figure in the import-export sector, known for his charm and business acumen. In reality, he was one of the most prolific traffickers in Asia. Wei's network stretched across Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, and into mainland China. He promised young women and children from struggling communities a future jobs in hotels, restaurants, or factories. But once they left home, they vanished into a system of abuse. Many were forced into grueling labor or sold into the sex trade. Wei recruited local agents from villages, offering them commissions to lure desperate families into handing over their children. A better life, he promised. But the reality was unrelenting labor, confinement, and abuse. Victims were smuggled across borders, in trucks, boats, and even shipping containers. Once inside a country, they were stripped of identification and handed over to handlers. From there, they were placed in brothels, sweatshops, or isolated rural work sites. Wei operated with brutal efficiency. He had corrupted border agents, police officers, and local officials in every country he worked in. The operation ran like a multinational corporation, only the product was people. It wasn't until an anonymous tip reached an international human rights organization that the tide began to turn. A joint task force comprising investigators from multiple Asian nations launched a large-scale probe. Thousands of hours of surveillance and undercover work followed. Slowly, piece by piece, the machinery of Wei's empire was revealed. Victim accounts, financial trails, and secret meeting recordings were compiled. And finally, the net closed in. Wei Jiao was arrested during a raid on one of his private compounds. The trial that followed revealed atrocities beyond imagination. Thousands had been trafficked, abused, and sold like property. The world watched in horror as the full scale of his crimes was laid bare. Wei's empire was destroyed, but the trauma he inflicted could never be undone. Like Holbrook and Olivia in Hobart, he had profited from suffering, but in the end, it was the bravery of victims' people, like Mia, who brought them all down. Their voices, once silenced by fear, had finally been heard. Victims began to come forward, bravely sharing the harrowing ordeals they had endured under Wei Jiao's control. Many described being physically and emotionally abused, threatened with death, and forced to work in inhumane conditions for little or no pay. Some had been locked in tiny rooms for days, sometimes weeks, without food, light, or contact with the outside world. They were moved under the cover of darkness, constantly living in fear and uncertainty. As testimonies mounted, authorities finally closed in on Wei's vast operation. He was arrested in late 2016, and the investigation that followed revealed a chilling truth. His human trafficking ring had been operating for nearly a decade. In that time, he had amassed millions of dollars by exploiting thousands of vulnerable people across multiple countries. Wei Jiao's capture was seen as a major victory in the global war against human trafficking, but it also exposed a far deeper, more troubling reality. This was not the work of one man. His empire thrived due to systemic failures, widespread corruption, and a lack of oversight that allowed his network to grow unchecked for years. And even after his arrest, many of his associates remained at large, continuing to prey on the weakest members of society. As the case made headlines around the world, Wei's story dominated media outlets across Asia and beyond. His dramatic fall from grace became symbolic of the hidden horrors lurking behind the respectable facades of business people and entrepreneurs. Behind his polished public image, Wei Jiao had operated like a puppet master controlling a vast, well-oiled machine that had destroyed countless lives. But even with Wei in custody, the ripple effects of his crimes continued to echo throughout the region. Survivors struggled to reintegrate into society. Many were left with lifelong trauma and carried the stigma of their past. Some had lost their families, others had no legal identity left. They were forced to start over with nothing, haunted by memories of violence, betrayal, and pain. As legal proceedings against Wei and his associates continued, investigators uncovered another disturbing layer to the case. His trafficking operation was deeply intertwined with legitimate businesses. Through a network of seemingly respectable establishments, including restaurants, construction companies, and bars, Wei laundered money and concealed the true source of his wealth. It was a system designed not just to exploit, but to endure. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation, shifting the focus from one man to an entire criminal infrastructure. It exposed a shocking depth of corruption that had allowed the network to flourish for so long, raising urgent questions about who else had been complicit. Wei Jiao's case became a brutal reminder of the darker side of the global economy, where human beings are treated as disposable commodities, traded for profit. It sparked renewed calls for stronger international cooperation, tougher anti-trafficking legislation, and more robust protections for those at risk of exploitation. As investigators dug deeper, law enforcement agencies across Southeast Asia began coordinating their efforts. Officers from China, Thailand, Malaysia, and Cambodia joined forces to dismantle the syndicate piece by piece. With each passing day, more victims were rescued more horrifying details emerged. The scale of Wei's operation was staggering. It wasn't just about smuggling people across borders. It was a deeply organized system with shocking efficiency. Dozens of safe houses were scattered across remote regions, hidden away from law enforcement. Victims were kept in isolation, denied daylight, and given barely enough food to survive. They were locked in rooms with no windows and no idea where they were, robbed of any chance to escape. Many victims were women and children, some as young as 12, who had been promised legitimate jobs in factories, hotels, or restaurants. Instead, they were sold into brothels or forced into hard labor under brutal conditions. Those who resisted were beaten or threatened with harm to their families. Fear was Wei's most effective weapon, and mercy was never part of the equation. Despite the scale and cruelty of the operation, authorities were not blind forever. Over the years, patterns began to emerge, patterns of missing persons, clusters of trafficking-related violence, and whispers of powerful figures shielding illegal operations. But the network's complexity and the corruption protecting its load any meaningful progress. Everything changed in 2016. It began when a young woman, barely 18 years old, was found wandering the streets outside Bangkok, malnourished and visibly traumatized. She had just escaped from a brothel, where she